Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be diving deep into something a little different.
Yeah, a little unexpected, you might say.
We're going to be exploring some Spanish philosophy.
That's right.
Specifically, a book by Gustavo Bueno called Teoría del cierre categorial.
Which translates to
Yeah.
Theory of Categorical Closure.
And it's a pretty dense book, but it's a really interesting one. I mean, it tackles some really big questions about the nature of science and even knowledge itself.
Yeah, it really gets into how we know what we know.
But don't worry if you're not a philosophy buff.
Right. You don't need a PhD to follow along.
We're going to break down the key ideas in a way that anyone can understand.
Well, make sure you come out of this deep dive feeling like you've really grasped some pretty complex concepts.
Exactly. So think of this as your crash course in Breno's unique perspective on scientific knowledge.
Exactly.
All right, so let's jump right in. The book's title mentions this idea of categorical closure, but what does that actually mean?
Well, imagine you're building a house, right? You've got all these different materials and tools.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
But ultimately, the structure itself creates its own contained system.
Right, a closed system.
Exactly. And Bueno's suggesting that scientific fields are kind of like that.
Oh, interesting.
They're not defined by some ultimate universal truth out there,
Hmm.
but rather by the connections and relationships built within their specific domain of knowledge.
Okay, so it's like each field has its own set of rules,
Yeah,
its own kind of internal language, almost like a world of its own.
that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what Bueno calls categorical closure.
So it's kind of like each field builds its own unique house of knowledge using different materials and blueprints, but ultimately creating a structure that holds meaning within its own boundaries.
I like that analogy.
It's a good one, right?
Yeah.
But how does this challenge the way we typically think about science?
Yeah.
You know, we often hear about science as this quest for objective truth.
Right, the idea that science is all about discovering absolute facts.
Exactly.
Well, that's where Bueno's approach gets really interesting.
Okay.
He challenges that traditional view. He critiques those classic ideas of science as just passively matching observations to some external reality.
So it's not just about looking at the world and recording what we see.
Nope. Bueno argues that it's much more active, much more constructive than that.
Interesting. So we're not just discovering truth, we're actively building it.
You got it. And he even pushes back against the idea that these grand overarching theories are the be-all and end-all of science. He thinks that by focusing so much on those theories, we can sometimes overlook the crucial role of experiments and actually applying scientific knowledge in the real world.
So it's not just about coming up with big ideas, but also about getting our hands dirty and actually putting those ideas to the test.
Precisely. It's about that interplay between theory and practice, the constant back and forth between abstract thinking and concrete action.
It's like science is a kind of dance between thinking and doing.
I like that dance.
And so how does Bueno see the role of the scientist in all this?
He has a great analogy for that. He compares them to watchmakers.
Watchmakers. Okay, that's an interesting comparison.
He says that a watchmaker doesn't need to have some deep philosophical understanding of time itself.
Right, they don't need to be Einstein.
Exactly. But they do need to know how to work with all those little gears and springs to build a system that measures time accurately.
Oh, I see.
So for Bueno, scientists are like skilled craftspeople.
It's not just about pondering the mysteries of the universe,
Right.
but actually about the hands-on work of constructing knowledge.
Exactly. They're manipulating and shaping their materials to create a coherent and functional system.
That's such a fascinating shift in perspective. It makes science seem much more grounded, you know?
Absolutely.
Less about abstract theorizing and more about the actual nitty-gritty of building knowledge systems.
And that leads us nicely into another key element of Bueno's theory, his materialist view of science.
Okay, now materialism in science. That sounds a little counterintuitive.
It might seem strange at first, but what Bueno is emphasizing is that the actual objects and phenomena being studied are an integral part of the scientific process.
They're not just abstract representations.
Nope, they're key players in the game.
So, to use an example, it's not just the name electron that matters.
Right.
It's the actual electron itself being manipulated and studied within a system that contributes to our knowledge of physics.
Exactly. And this leads us to Bueno's idea of scientific constructions. They're not just theoretical concepts floating out there in the abstract.
Right, they have to be grounded in something real.
Absolutely. They involve actual physical objects.
Yeah, the tools of the trade.
The languages we use to describe those objects.
The instruments we use to measure them.
The specific operations and experiments.
And even the scientists themselves.
All working together in a dynamic and interconnected system.
It's almost like science becomes a performance with all these different actors playing their roles on a very complex stage.
I love that. A performance.
It captures the dynamism, you know? But if these systems are so self-contained,
Right, if they're closed, as Bueno calls them.
then how do they actually produce knowledge that's considered true?
Ah, good question. And that's where Bueno's concept of truth as synthetic identity comes in.
Okay, synthetic identity. That's a new one.
It might sound complicated, but it's actually quite elegant.
Right. Break it down for me.
Bueno's saying that scientific truth isn't about finding some perfect one-to-one correspondence between our theories and the world. It's not about mirroring reality.
Okay, so it's not about just finding the right answer that's already out there somewhere.
Right, it's about constructing those answers.
Constructing truth.
Exactly. Through this rigorous process of experimentation, observation, and constant theoretical development.
So it's an active process, not a passive discovery.
Exactly. It's a process of synthesis.
Bringing together different pieces to create a complete picture.
You got it.
So in a way, science is creating its own versions of truth.
Within these closed systems.
Right, within those specific domains of knowledge.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really making me rethink how I understand science. It's not about finding some ultimate truth that's already out there.
Right.
But about this dynamic and ongoing process of building and refining knowledge.
Within those specific frameworks.
Right, within those frameworks. That's amazing. But hold on a second. Does that mean that every scientific field is kind of making up its own truth? Like, is physics subject to the same rules as, say, psychology?
That's a great question. And it leads us to one of the most fascinating and potentially controversial aspects of Bueno's theory, his classification of the sciences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does he differentiate between all these different scientific fields?
Well, he makes this key distinction between what he calls human and non-human sciences.
Human versus non-human. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's all based on the role of the subject in the research.
Like, by subject, you mean the researcher themselves, like the scientist conducting the experiment.
Precisely. In human sciences, fields like psychology, sociology, anthropology.
Right, where you're studying people.
Exactly. The researcher is inherently part of the system they're studying.
Makes sense. You can't really separate the observer from the observed in those cases.
Exactly. And that creates some unique challenges and possibilities.
Because your own biases and interpretations as a researcher are always going to be in play.
Exactly. And that's something that Bueno really grapples with in his theory.
Wow, that adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It does. But he doesn't see this as making human sciences any less scientific.
Okay.
He acknowledges that they have their own distinct logic and methods because of this inherent subjectivity.
So we're left with this idea that different fields operate within their own unique closed systems, with their own rules and ways of constructing knowledge.
Yeah, and those systems...
But they're also interconnected, right?
Absolutely.
Constantly influencing and evolving through interactions with each other and with the world around them.
You've got it. And that's just the beginning.
There's so much more to unpack in Bueno's work.
Oh yeah, we've just scratched the surface here.
But this is already giving me so much to think about.
It's definitely thought-provoking stuff.
So let's take a quick pause here, folks. We'll be back in a moment to dive even deeper into the fascinating world of Gustavo Bueno's theory of categorical closure.
Don't go anywhere.
Okay, we're back and ready to plunge even deeper into this fascinating theory of categorical closure.
All right, let's do it.
Now, we talk about how scientific fields are kind of like unique structures.
Yeah, each with its own kind of internal logic.
Right, its own way of building knowledge. But I'm curious, how do these structures, these categories, actually evolve over time? I mean, does Bueno have anything to say about that?
He absolutely does. His theory is all about understanding how scientific knowledge is not static. It's constantly being constructed, refined, challenged, and reshaped.
That's a dynamic process.
Exactly. And one of the ways he illustrates this is through what he calls dialectics.
Okay, dialectics. Now that sounds a little intimidating.
I know, it's one of those words that can make your eyes glaze over.
Yeah, but I have a feeling you're going to break it down for us.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually a very intuitive concept once you wrap your head around it.
All right, I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Basically, it's all about recognizing that knowledge doesn't just emerge in a vacuum. It's constantly being shaped by tensions and interactions.
Tension. So, like, there's conflict involved?
Well, not necessarily conflict in a negative sense, but definitely a kind of push and pull, a back and forth that drives the development of knowledge.
Okay, so it's like a dynamic process where ideas are constantly bumping up against each other, challenging each other, and refining each other.
You got it. And Bueno identifies several levels of these interactions, or these dialectics.
Oh, okay, so there are different types of these dialectics.
Exactly. So first, you have the dialectic within a specific field, where new discoveries might challenge existing theories and kind of push the boundaries of what we know.
So like those paradigm shifts we hear about, where a whole way of thinking is completely overturned by some groundbreaking discovery.
Exactly. Think about the shift from Newtonian physics to Einstein's theory of relativity, right? That was a major dialectical moment in the history of science.
Yeah, that completely revolutionized our understanding of the universe.
Exactly. And then you have the dialectic between different scientific fields where they kind of cross-fertilize and influence each other.
So it's like those fields are having a conversation with each other, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, but always pushing each other forward.
That's a great way to put it. Like advances in biology, for instance, can lead to new insights in chemistry or even physics.
It's like this interconnected web of knowledge where every new discovery can have ripple effects across multiple disciplines.
Exactly. It's really a fascinating process to think about.
It is. So how does this all play out in the real world? Can you give us an example of how these dialectics have actually shaped a specific scientific concept?
Absolutely. One of the most interesting examples that Bueno explores is the concept of species in biology.
Oh, species. Yeah, that seems like a pretty straightforward idea.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But it's actually been incredibly challenging to define in a way that really captures the complexity of the natural world.
Really? Why is that?
Well, because nature doesn't always fit neatly into those categories that we humans like to create.
Right. Nature is messy.
Exactly. It's fluid and constantly changing, and our attempts to define something like species have had to evolve along with our understanding of those processes.
I can see how that would be a tricky concept to pin down.
It is. Early attempts to classify organisms often relied on really superficial similarities.
Like how they look or how they behave.
Exactly. But as scientists developed more sophisticated tools and techniques for studying the natural world,
They were able to look deeper, beyond the surface.
exactly. And this led to the development of classification systems based on evolutionary relationships. So the focus shifted from outward appearances to things like shared ancestry and common descent.
So instead of these fixed, unchanging categories, we started to see species as fluid and interconnected, constantly evolving over time.
Exactly. It's a much more dynamic and nuanced understanding.
And that shift in understanding, that evolution of the concept of species, was driven by those dialectical interactions we were talking about.
Precisely. New discoveries within biology challenge those older, more static theories.
Right? Pushing the boundaries of the field.
While insights from other fields, like genetics and paleontology, really help to enrich our understanding of how life on Earth has evolved over millions of years.
It's like the very definition of a species has been on its own evolutionary journey.
I like that. It's a great way to put it.
So it's not about finding some final definitive answer, but about this constant process of construction, refinement, and adaptation.
Exactly. And this applies not just to the concept of species, but to all scientific concepts.
So scientific knowledge is always evolving, always being reshaped by those dialectical interactions.
You got it. It's never static, never finished, which makes it so fascinating and exciting to study.
That's so true. It's not about memorizing a set of facts, but about understanding how those facts are interconnected, how they've evolved, and how they continue to be challenged and refined.
Precisely. It's about developing that critical and discerning eye, that ability to question, to evaluate evidence, to see the bigger picture.
Wow, I'm starting to see how this goes way beyond just the realm of science.
Oh, absolutely. This notion of dialectics, of knowledge being shaped by tensions and interactions, it's relevant to so many areas of life.
Yeah, I can see how that applies to everything from political debates to personal relationships.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that knowledge is never neutral. It's always being shaped by context, by power dynamics, by different perspectives.
Okay, my brain is officially in overdrive with all these ideas. But there's one more question I can't shake.
Go for it.
We've talked a lot about these closed systems, these categories within science. But how do these systems interact with the broader realm of non-scientific knowledge? Like, does Bueno see a hard line between science and things like philosophy or art?
That's a fantastic question, and one that gets to the heart of how Bueno views the relationship between different ways of understanding the world.
Hmm.
And while he really emphasizes the distinct nature of scientific knowledge,
Right, it has its own rules and methods?
exactly, he doesn't see it as completely isolated from other domains of knowledge.
Okay, so there's some overlap.
There's definitely a dialogue going on, a kind of cross-pollination of ideas.
Interesting. So how does that work in practice?
Well, for instance, when we look at the relationship between science and philosophy, it's clear that philosophical ideas have often played a significant role in shaping the course of scientific inquiry.
Oh, yeah, like how the ancient Greeks, with their focus on logic and reason, really laid the groundwork for the development of Western science.
Exactly. They were asking those fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the cosmos, the
Yeah,
human
really.
condition. And those questions really set the stage for the scientific revolution that followed. Precisely. And even today, many of those big philosophical questions about the nature of reality, causality, knowledge, and ethics, they continue to inform and challenge scientific thinking.
It's like philosophy is providing the conceptual framework within which science operates.
In a way, yes. And it's not just a one-way street either.
Oh, so science also pushes back on philosophy.
Absolutely. Scientific discoveries can challenge and sometimes even completely overturn long-held philosophical assumptions.
So it's more like a dynamic interplay, a back and forth between the two.
Exactly. Think about how discoveries in quantum mechanics have really forced philosophers to rethink some of their fundamental concepts about space, time, and causality.
Yeah, it's like science is constantly throwing curveballs that
Yeah.
philosophy has to try to catch.
That's a great way to put it. It's that dynamic tension between the two that keeps both fields vibrant and constantly evolving.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about art? Where does that fit into this whole scheme?
That's an interesting one. They might seem like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Science all about objectivity and reason, and art all about subjectivity and emotion.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily think they'd have much in common?
But Bueno suggests that there are actually some deep connections there as well.
Really? I'm curious to hear this.
He argues that both science and art are engaged in this process of representation.
Hmm.
They're both trying to make sense of the world, trying to capture and express something about the human experience.
Okay, so they have a shared goal, in a sense?
In a way, yes. And while scientific models and theories might strive for objectivity and accuracy, they're still ultimately representations of reality.
They're still using language, symbols, and images to try to communicate complex ideas.
Exactly. And similarly, art often draws inspiration from the natural world.
Right. Think about all those Renaissance paintings exploring anatomy and perspective.
Exactly. And in more modern times, you have artists engaging with concepts from physics, biology, even computer science.
So it's like both science and art are trying to grapple with the big questions, but using different tools and different languages.
That's a great way to put it.
So even though they have different methods and different goals, they're both contributing to our understanding of the world.
Exactly. They both enrich our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe.
I love that. But could you give some more concrete examples of how science and art actually interact? Like, how does that play out in the real world?
Oh, there are so many examples. Think about the intersection of biology and sculpture.
Okay, yeah. Anatomical studies have been a source of inspiration for artists for centuries, right?
Exactly. From those classical Greek statues to Renaissance masterpieces, artists have used their understanding of human anatomy to create works that are both aesthetically beautiful and scientifically informative.
So it's not just about art imitating nature, but also about art helping us understand nature.
Precisely. And in more modern times, you have this whole field of scientific visualization.
Oh yeah, those amazing images and animations that can help us grasp those complex scientific data sets.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how art and science can collaborate to create new forms of knowledge and understanding.
It's like art can make science more accessible and engaging for a wider audience.
Absolutely. And it just shows how these seemingly separate domains of knowledge are actually deeply interconnected and constantly influencing each other.
This is all so fascinating, but before we get too carried away with art and science, I want to bring us back to a potential concern that we touched on earlier.
Okay, what's up?
We've been talking about all these non-scientific influences on science, like philosophy and art, but could these influences sometimes lead science astray? I mean, is there a danger there?
That's a really valid concern, and Bueno acknowledges that potential pitfall. He points out that ideological biases, political pressures, even religious beliefs, those can all sometimes distort scientific inquiry.
So it's important to be aware of those potential biases and to make sure that scientific research remains grounded in evidence and rigorous methodology.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant about that and remember that science is a human endeavor.
Right. Scientists are people too.
And they're subject to the same biases and influences as anyone else, and that's why it's so crucial to have those systems of checks and balances in place.
Like peer review and open debate within the scientific community.
Exactly. Those help to mitigate those biases and make sure that the scientific process is as objective and rigorous as possible.
That makes sense, but it raises another question. How do we distinguish between legitimate scientific knowledge and claims that are based on ideology or what we might call pseudoscience?
That's a crucial question, especially in today's world where misinformation can spread so easily.
Well, it's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
It is. But Bueno's theory actually provides some tools for addressing that very challenge.
Okay, how so?
He argues that a key criterion for genuine scientific knowledge is its ability to achieve what he calls categorical closure.
Okay, remind me again what that means.
Remember those unique structures we talked about, those houses of knowledge that each scientific field builds?
Yeah?
Well, categorical closure refers to the way those structures create their own internal systems of meaning and validation. They have their own specific principles, methods, and criteria for evaluating knowledge claims.
So a scientific claim is only considered legitimate if it can be validated within the framework of its own field.
Exactly. It's not about appealing to some external authority or relying on subjective beliefs.
It's about meeting the standards of evidence and methodology that are specific to that particular domain of science.
Precisely. And that process of validation typically involves rigorous testing, peer review, and open debate within the scientific community.
Right, so it's a collective effort, not just one person's opinion.
Exactly. And that's how we can start to distinguish between genuine science and pseudoscience.
Okay, so how do those pseudoscientific claims typically fall short?
Well, they often lack that kind of internal coherence and validation that we see in legitimate science. They might rely on anecdotal evidence, cherry-picking data, or appealing to emotions rather than sound reasoning.
So they're kind of taking shortcuts, not really following the rigorous methods of science.
Exactly. And they often operate outside of the established systems of peer review and scientific debate.
So they're not really engaging with the broader scientific community. They're kind of off doing their own thing.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for all of us to be able to critically evaluate the information that we encounter.
Right, we can't just take everything at face value.
Especially in today's world where information overload is a real problem.
Okay, this is all incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
But can you give our listeners some practical tips for how to actually discern reliable scientific information?
Absolutely. One of the most important things is to be wary of claims that sound too good to be true or that promise really simple solutions to complex problems.
So if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
More often than not, that's a good rule of thumb.
Okay, what else?
It's also crucial to look for evidence of consensus within the scientific community.
So if the vast majority of experts in a particular field agree on a certain conclusion, it's likely to be more reliable than some fringe theory that's only supported by a handful of dissenters.
That's a good way to think about it. Doesn't mean that the consensus is always right.
Right, science is always evolving.
Exactly. But it's a good starting point, especially if you're not an expert in that particular field.
That makes sense, but what about those situations where there is legitimate scientific debate or controversy? I mean, how do we navigate those complexities?
That's where it becomes really important to look at the quality of the evidence being presented.
So things like the size and design of the studies, the statistical significance of the findings, whether the research has been replicated by other scientists.
Exactly. And it's also important to consider who's funding the research.
Oh yeah, that can be a big factor.
It can. And whether there are any potential conflicts of interest, those things can sometimes influence the outcomes of scientific studies, so it's essential to be aware of them.
This is all incredibly valuable information. But it sounds like it requires a fair amount of scientific literacy to be able to apply these criteria effectively.
You're absolutely right, it does.
And it really highlights the importance of science education and communication, right?
Absolutely. We need to empower everyone with the tools to think critically about scientific claims.
And to make informed decisions about their lives based on solid evidence.
Exactly. And that's why initiatives like this podcast are so important.
Yes. We're trying to break down those complex ideas into something that everyone can understand and engage with.
And hopefully inspire a lifelong love of learning and critical thinking.
This has been such an enlightening conversation. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of Bueno's theory.
There's always more to explore.
But we've already uncovered so many fascinating insights.
It's definitely a rich and complex body of work.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But I'm wondering how these ideas actually play out in those fields beyond science, like we touched upon philosophy and art. But what about other areas of human knowledge? How does this concept of categorical closure apply there?
That's a great question. And it takes us to the heart of Bueno's overall philosophical project.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
He argues that this principle of categorical closure isn't just limited to science. It actually applies to all forms of human understanding, including philosophy itself.
Wait, so you're saying that philosophy also operates within its own kind of closed system?
According to Bueno, yes, with its own internal logic and methods for validating knowledge.
So it's not just a bunch of philosophers sitting around in armchairs debating the meaning of life.
Well, they might be sitting in armchairs, but there's a lot more structure to it than you might think.
Okay, now my mind is officially ready to be blown. Let's dive into that fascinating philosophical rabbit hole in our next segment.
Let's do it.
All right, knowledge seekers, we're back, ready for the final leg of our deep dive into Gustavo Bueno's theory of categorical closure.
Let's do it.
If you thought things were getting mind-bending before, well, buckle up, because we're about to go full meta.
That's right. We've talked about how scientific fields create these closed systems for building knowledge, but what happens when Bueno turns that lens on philosophy itself?
Yeah, that's what I'm really curious about.
That's where things get really interesting.
So you're saying that philosophy isn't just this free-flowing realm of opinions and abstract ideas. It has its own set of rules, its own boundaries.
According to Bueno, absolutely. He argues that philosophy, just like science, operates within a closed system with its own unique logic and methods.
So it's not just a bunch of philosophers sitting around in armchairs debating the meaning of life. There's actually a structured way of approaching these big philosophical questions.
Exactly. Bueno sees philosophy as a rigorous discipline, one that's focused on analyzing and clarifying those fundamental categories of human thought and experience.
Okay, so what do those categories look like in the realm of philosophy? Can you give our listeners some examples?
Sure, think about concepts like being, substance, causality, knowledge, or even truth.
Right, those really big abstract concepts.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of categories that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
It's like philosophy is trying to create a map of that conceptual landscape upon which all other knowledge is built.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And Bueno believes that this process of analyzing and clarifying those fundamental categories, it's crucial for understanding the limits and the possibilities of human thought itself.
So it's not just about coming up with those really clever arguments or grand theories. It's also about doing the meticulous work of defining the very building blocks of our thinking.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Bueno argues that this process can actually be quite scientific in its approach.
Wait, really? How can philosophy be scientific? I mean, it doesn't involve experiments or data collection in the same way that, say, physics does.
That's true. It might not involve test tubes and microscopes, but Bueno emphasizes that philosophy requires its own kind of rigor.
Okay, so what does that rigor look like in philosophy?
Well, he stresses the importance of logical consistency.
Right, making sure your arguments actually make sense.
Conceptual precision, so being very careful about how you define your terms.
Avoiding those vague or ambiguous concepts.
And, of course, systematic argumentation, building your case in a clear and persuasive way.
So even though philosophy deals with those really big abstract ideas, it still demands that same level of intellectual discipline and scrutiny as any scientific field.
Absolutely. And Bueno believes that this rigor is essential for distinguishing genuine philosophical insights from mere speculation or just personal opinion.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects back to his theory of categorical closure.
Right.
Each field, whether it's physics or philosophy or history, it constructs its own internal world of meaning, and it validates knowledge within that system.
Exactly. Philosophical claims, just like scientific ones, have to be justified within the framework of their own domain.
It's not about appealing to some external authority.
Right. It's about engaging in rigorous debate and analysis within the philosophical community.
So even those huge philosophical questions about the meaning of life or the nature of reality, they have to be tackled within this structured system of philosophical inquiry.
That's right. It's not just about having a brilliant idea. It's about grounding that idea in a coherent and well-supported argument.
This is making me realize that philosophy is a lot more demanding than I initially thought. But if philosophy operates within its own closed system, how does it interact with other fields, like science? We talked earlier about how they kind of influence and challenge each other.
Right, and Bueno acknowledges the importance of those interactions. He sees them as part of that broader dialectical process we discussed, where different systems of knowledge are constantly pushing and pulling on each other.
So it's not like philosophy is off in its own little corner, completely isolated from the world of science.
Not at all. There's definitely a conversation happening between those fields, but Bueno is careful to point out that philosophy isn't just there to serve science.
It's not just a handmaiden to science, there to kind of clean up after the scientists have made their discoveries.
Exactly. He believes philosophy has its own independent line of inquiry,
Okay.
and it can provide some really crucial insights into the very foundations of scientific knowledge.
So philosophy can help us understand, like, the assumptions and the limitations of science itself.
Precisely. It's like philosophy is holding up a mirror to science, helping it to reflect on its own methods and its own assumptions.
That's a really powerful image. But I'm also wondering, can philosophy tackle those questions that science can't even touch?
You're hitting on a really key point there. Bueno believes that philosophy is uniquely equipped to explore those questions that lie beyond the reach of scientific methods.
Okay, like what kinds of questions?
Questions about consciousness, free will, the meaning of life, the nature of morality.
Right, those big existential questions that we humans have been wrestling with for millennia.
Exactly. And Bueno sees these questions as crucial to the human experience, even if they don't lend themselves to those neat and tidy scientific answers.
So it's like philosophy can venture into those deeper realms where science might not have the tools to tread.
That's one way to think about it. And it highlights the unique and important role that philosophy plays in our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. This is all so intellectually stimulating, but I want to bring it back down to earth for our listeners.
Sure.
What are the practical implications of all this? Why should anyone care about these seemingly abstract philosophical debates?
That's a great question, and I think Bueno's work really highlights the importance of what we might call philosophical literacy.
Okay, philosophical literacy, I like that.
Just as scientific literacy helps us understand the natural world, philosophical literacy equips us to navigate the complexities of human thought and experience.
So it's not just about being well-versed in, like, the history of philosophy or knowing all the famous philosophers and their arguments.
Right.
It's also about developing a certain way of thinking.
Exactly. It's about developing that critical and analytical approach to ideas, to concepts, to arguments.
And that kind of philosophical thinking, it can be incredibly valuable in everyday life.
Well, absolutely. It can help you make more informed decisions. It can help you grapple with ethical dilemmas. It can help you understand the nuances of current events and engage in those difficult conversations in a more thoughtful and constructive way.
It's like philosophy gives us this toolkit for thinking more deeply and more critically about the world around us and our place in it.
I love that, a toolkit. That's a great way to put it.
This has been such an incredible journey through Bueno's work. I know I've learned a ton, and I hope our listeners have too.
Me too.
It's definitely challenging stuff, but it's so rewarding to grapple with these big ideas.
Absolutely.
And even if you don't agree with everything Bueno says, his ideas offer this really powerful framework for thinking about the nature of knowledge, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the importance of critical thinking in a world that's just overflowing with information.
That's a great way to sum it up.
So until our next deep dive, keep those minds curious, keep those critical thinking skills sharp, and don't be afraid to delve into those big questions that make us human.
Well said. Keep exploring,